Hello and welcome to briefing number 11 from the Worshipful Company of Marketers in the series Marketing for Charities. In this briefing we're going to cover the fourth part of our discussion on tactics, which will cover the area of fundraising. My name's Peter Rees and it's my pleasure to be your narrator and presenter once again. On this slide I'm going to go through the agenda items that we're going to cover in today's briefing. I'll start with a short introduction that positions this briefing in terms of the overall series, and then I'll go into my first discussion, which is all about fundraising in theory and practice. I'm then going to go into some more practical advice on how to set up fundraising campaigns for the different stakeholder groups with whom you're trying to communicate. I'll remind you of the next step in the overall briefing programme and finish as usual with a reminder of how questions can be answered and a concluding quotation. I'll remind you where this briefing fits in the overall structure in the series. We're still looking at the tactics part of SOSTAC, which answers the question which way is best, and in this briefing, as I said, I'm going to focus on the area of fundraising. There's some more information about that in the next briefing, which is Tactics Part 5, which is the Economic Recovery Guide, which is produced for you by my colleagues in the outreach team of the Worshipful Company of Marketers. So let's get started on the first section of today's briefing on fundraising. I'll start by looking at a little bit of theory about fundraising and then get on to the detail of how one would go about it for your own organisation. As this diagram shows you, fundraising really is at the heart of all charity marketing. What we're going to look at in this briefing is three areas. First of all, we're going to talk about the different sources of funding, and once we've identified those, we'll look at the different tactics one could use to address the opportunity that each one provides. And you should consider these tactics in combination with our previous discussions in the marketing communication section of the earlier tactics briefing. I'm then going to round off today's discussion overall with some advice on how to design campaigns to address the different opportunities in the different target stakeholder groups to do with fundraising. I'll start by looking at something that I've called the funding pyramid, which really is a summary of the different stakeholder groups with whom you might wish to engage in order to generate funds for our charity. And having identified them on this slide, I'm going to go through them one by one on subsequent slides and talk about the different tactics that one could use to work with them to generate funds for the charity based on their characteristics and motivations. And as you can see here, working from the bottom upwards, we have members of the public, then we have alumni and beneficiaries of our charity. Now, depending on what your charity does, beneficiaries might be human beings that you can talk to and get information from, and alumni are people who've gone through whatever service your charity provides and then have gone on to in later life to become successful and are often very keen to continue to support the charity that provided service and benefits for them earlier on in their life. I'll just remind you then of the opportunity that one can engage with getting funding from the different fundholder organisations that exist, then look at how you can engage with businesses and other corporate entities. And then finally I'll talk about high net worth individuals and see the opportunity that might be present to engage with them to generate funds for the charity. So let's get started with the first group here, which is the public. For all of these groups, I'm going to look at two sections on each slide. The first one is the characteristics and motivation of people in this group. Then I'm going to talk about the opportunity and the techniques you could use to engage with them and an overall observation about this particular segment as a whole. So the public is, of course, the most prevalent providers of funding and donations to charities. And let's look at what their characteristics are and what sort of things motivate them. Now, many charities find that they obtain donations on an ad hoc basis. If a particular thing has happened in the world, a disaster, a famine, a medical emergency, then people are often very willing to just reach into their pockets and make a small ad hoc one-time donation just because they're moved or motivated by the information that you've provided for them or the thing that's happened in society or in a particular situation in the world. What we try and do is once we've got those donations, we should keep in contact with them and see if we can persuade them to be signed up donors. That is to say, they've put up a standing order or a direct debit to provide a regular source of income for the charity. Now, if you have people in that category, don't be afraid to ask them for an increase. So let's say somebody's had a standing order or direct debit with you for a number of years. It's perfectly acceptable to write to them, and I hope you're doing this all the time, to give them regular news about the charity, but it's perfectly acceptable to write to them and remind them that costs have gone up and ask them if they'd kindly give you a small increase in their standing order or their direct debit. And that's a good way of generating a step income and increase from public donors. There's also their involvement with the charities due to an emotional or transient response because they feel sorry for the people who are suffering the famine or the flood victims or the people who are suffering from a particular medical situation. Whatever it happens to be, they tend to have an emotional, maybe a transient connection with the charity. It sort of tugs at their heartstrings, or it's something that they feel is important and should be addressed in society. They may be personally affected. I'm thinking here of things like medical charities, cancer charities. Most people in society today either have had the unfortunate impact of somebody in their own friends and family circle who've been affected by cancer, or it's something that they're concerned about on a personal basis. So there's often a personal connection which you can build upon in your communications to people and explain the benefits that you can change with donations from people like them and members of the public. They're often warm-hearted, and although it's silly to say, of a charitable inclination. So that being the case, those are the characteristics and motivations of members of the public, generally speaking the ones who want to donate to charities. So let's see how we can capitalise on this goodwill with different communications techniques that we might use. The first thing, and it sounds quite obvious, is to say that you should put a donate button everywhere that you have an engagement or communication with your target audience, and that means your website, your emails, on social media, and basically anywhere that people can interact with your channels online, have a donate button, so they can be motivated. Just click one button and go to perhaps a financial collection service to make a donation to your charity. And then if you look at the 4 different steps of the RISA model: reach, interact, connect, engage and retain, there are techniques we can use which I've gone through previously, but we'll look at them here, particularly in the area of fundraising. The first step is reach, and if you remember, that's all about advertising and making the first connection with your target stakeholder, in this case members of the public. And what you're trying to do in this very early stage is capture their email so you can start an ongoing conversation with them for the next stage, which is I for interact. And here it's all about content marketing, sending them information in forms of newsletters or briefings or white papers or testimonials or reference stories to bring them up to date and interact and interest them in the work of your charity. The C, the connect stage in terms of donation and fundraising, is to persuade these target audience and the public to make a donation. Often they just mentally think of perhaps a one-time donation, but what I'm suggesting you do is, once you've captured that and you've got their email address, continue to communicate with them and ask them if they'd be kind enough to set a regular payment stream for your organisation. You can also use community marketing and events and coffee mornings nowadays online to build further engagement with members of the public and start to build a family and a community with a positive attitude and an interest in your charity. The final stage of RISA is engage and retain, and here we want to send out newsletters, case studies, references, and perhaps start a donor get donor program. Once you've got somebody established as a donor, ask them if they know anybody else like them with whom you can then communicate, and ask them if they too would like to be a donor for your company. Another good technique is to create a wills and bequests guide, and a charity that I worked with about 8 or 10 years ago was the Royal National Children's Foundation, and they did a super job in creating a wills and bequests guide which they sent out in their newsletter. You could download it from your website and went all through the legal niceties and advice on how to do that, including the necessary documents to be able to set up a standing order, a direct debit, or instructions to your solicitor if you want to make an amendment to your will to include this particular charity as a possible beneficiary after your passing. The final thing is, if you are communicating with people and once you've got their email address, one of the things you'd often try and do is get them to sign up for your newsletter. Now, I've said this before in a previous briefing, but it is quite important that you personalise your newsletter. I've seen charities who very proudly say that they have a newsletter, which they send out, let's say, monthly, but they send it to everybody. They send it to donors, sponsors, companies, individuals, beneficiaries, the local authority. Everybody gets exactly the same newsletter. And it's unlikely, if you think about it, that the different groups of members of the public, companies, high net worth individuals, or fundraisers or fund holders are going to all have the same interests. So personalise your newsletter and make a particular newsletter that has information that's relevant, in this case, to members of the public. The next group of people I've categorised together are beneficiaries, alumni and celebrities, and sometimes these categories overlap. So let's look at the characteristics and motivation. Typically, if you want to promote the good work for your charity, one of the best ways to do it is talk about the outcome you have on your beneficiaries. So if, for example, you're a charity that deals with people with a particular medical condition or mental condition, or people who've had a disadvantaged upbringing and you're changing their lives in a positive way, often the stories that they have to tell are very inspiring and very impressive, and they create audience connection and empathy. And a good example of this is the Royal National Children's Foundation, which I've mentioned before, which was a charity that provides free boarding school places for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. And as I'll explain later on, they used to hold regular dinners for donors and high net worth individuals where young people would come along and tell their stories and explain the terrible situation they started off with when young, and how being helped and assisted by the Royal National Children's Foundation made a huge difference to their lives, some of whom went on then to have fantastic careers with academic success and be excellent in sport or music or politics or other fields. One of their alumni was, for example, a member of Parliament. Another one was a international rugby player who played for the England team and captained the England team, and so on. So having inspiring and impressive case stories and studies to give and share creates a huge amount of empathy and audience connection, as I say. Many of these beneficiaries or alumni are willing to give back and help and support the charity that helped them through a difficult stage in their life. They make great spokespeople for your organisation, and they're great to have at an event, now an online event or a Zoom event. They're great to make videos where they're talking to camera about the change that the charity made to their lives, and they really do do a great job to communicate the benefits on a personal basis. They're talking about themselves and their own lives and the success and the change that it's made by having the support and help from the particular charity. Sometimes, if they're famous or celebrities even, they might be happy to have their name, but often if you're doing case studies, more, let's say, down-to-earth beneficiaries or alumni may wish to have their case study anonymised, and of course you must accept that, but that still goes a long way if you just refer to somebody by an anonymised or a first name. If you look at the tools and techniques you can use for these people, celebrities generate interest, so whether you're talking about news and trying to attract others to the work of the charity, having a celebrity spokesperson or a celebrity case study can go a long way to do that. The work that they do and their story is inspirational. They can be used as a magnet for upmarket events, and as I say, the Royal National Children's Foundation had a fantastic dinner at St James Palace in London, where Her Royal Highness the Princess Royal Princess Anne was actually the host, because she is the honorary chairman of the charity, or she was then when I worked with them. It makes a great news story which can then be shared through public relations and also with case studies. And they can also speak for your organisation. There was another charity that I worked with which dealt with treating members of the armed services with post-traumatic stress disorder, and they hosted a fantastic event at the House of Lords in a room that was provided for us by one of the MPs who supported the charity, and we had some fantastic speakers. We had the former head of the armed forces for the UK, who was a general at the time. We had several MPs, a minister and some medical people talking about the work and the changes that treating PTSD can make to people's lives. So these sorts of areas are really inspirational and are a great way to generate interest and obviously donations for your charity. So consider this as a possible opportunity for you. The next area I want to look at is that of fund holders, and there'll be more information about this in the next briefing, as I said, where we're talking about the Economic Recovery Guide. But for now, just let me give you some characteristics of fund holders. They tend to be very keen, but also very cautious, and fund holders may be part of an organisation which is also a charity. It might be part of a central or local government, or it might be part of a trust or foundation which is set up to make donations and support for charities in a particular sector. So you need to understand the very specific focus areas of the different fund holder groups with whom you might engage. They tend to be very keen about their particular area of interest, whether it's medical or educational or social or cultural, whatever it is that they're focused on providing help for, then you must understand and see how well your organisation fits with their aims and objectives. And if you don't, if you're not a good fit, really don't waste your time engaging with them, because they will turn you down. On the other hand, if you are a good fit, you have the opportunity to have access to some quite large sources of funds, as I'll explain in the next briefing. People who work for fund holding bodies are very businesslike and very professional, and they're very sector focused. So as I say, understand what their aims and objectives are and see the extent to which they are in accord with those of your charity. Once you've done that piece of work, these are the techniques that you can use to identify and look at the match between your organisation and the different fund holder groups. It really starts off with a lot of desk research, though there is an organisation called fundsonline.org.uk, which you can subscribe to, which also gives you advice and guidance on where to go and look for different fund holder groups and fund holding charities. So you can do some desk research. In order to apply, you're going to have to be quite good at copywriting and form filling, because that's the process that many of them go through. You'll have to fill in forms and write explanations and justifications and descriptions of the work of your charity and show how well it fits with their aims and objectives in order to obtain funding from them. So as I say, this will be covered again in the next briefing, so look out for more information on this in briefing number 12. The next group of stakeholders with whom you might wish to connect to obtain donations are businesses or larger corporate bodies. So businesses can be anybody from a small local business in your area up to a national or international body, and corporates can be anything up to global companies. So let's look at the interests and motivation of people in this stakeholder group. What are their characteristics? Well, first of all, many of them will be supporting charities because it fits in with their corporate social responsibility programme. More and more large corporations nowadays are taking an active role to show and demonstrate their support for things like global warming or medical situations, or helping out in times of crisis or famine or natural disaster. They may give you support in terms of cash or help in kind. And for example, there was a large bank that I worked with a few years ago that actually offered its boardroom and its headquarters in Docklands in London for the particular charity that I was working with to hold their annual general meeting. And this went on for about 3 or 4 years. They also made a sizable cash donation as well, because they fitted in with the work and aims of this charity. Even though they're a bank and in a different sector, it really did fit in with what they were hoping to achieve. Some organisations also would give you access to its own people. And here, for example, when I worked for IBM, the computer company, and this was about 15-20 years ago, they had a programme whereby they would allow their members of their staff to nominate a chosen charity, in which case IBM would match that individual's donations from their payroll, and also allow their members of staff time off. Now in the UK, the Cooperative Society does the same thing, or did the same thing. It gives their members of staff a number of days a year off to help charities of their choice, typically in their local area. Now, as a result of this, these organisations expect some sort of quid pro quo and some benefit in return, which of course is normal and totally acceptable. So this could be either recognition or reward or publicity. So for example, your charity could do a press release and talk about the support you're getting from this organisation, or you could allow the corporate organisation to talk about the work that it's doing with your charity. So whether the charity issues the press release and does the messaging, or the corporate entity, then that's a normal sort of quid pro quo exchange of value, if you like. They often would like access to your communications, and so allow them to speak about you at conferences and meetings they have. And in fact, they might be willing to come and speak at events that you're putting on to talk about the work that you do and how important it is and how happy they are to sponsor you. So let's look at the sort of programs that you could use to engage with businesses and corporate sponsors and fundraisers. You can do a campaign to communicate with these different individuals simply to raise cash using the messaging that I've talked about in the earlier briefing on corporate communications. You can also campaign to get sponsorship on the charity's website or your events. So for example, you could invite one of these corporate supporters to come and be a speaker at your meeting or at a conference or at a dinner that you're holding, or when you're engaging with other, say, high net worth individuals. They can also sponsor your website, and often if you go through charities' websites, you can see that the whole website or sections of it are sponsored or supported by Company X as part of their corporate social responsibility program. Microsoft do this a lot with when they're supporting or providing computer equipment to companies that deal with people with learning difficulties or accessibility difficulties accessing computer technology. You could also consider appointing a senior person from your corporate sponsor to or be a member of your board of trustees for the normal 3-year period, and this is a good way to cement the relationship and help them to get slightly more involved and engage with your charity operation. Now, there's another idea that I talked about, I think, in the previous discussion on communications, which is setting up an advisory board. And if you remember, I gave you the example of an advisory board which was set up by a charity that I worked with that provided support for former members of the armed services with post-traumatic stress disorder. And they set up an advisory board with a senior service person, a general in the British Army who was on their advisory board, a member of Parliament from the Department of Health was on their advisory board, and an academic from a university who treated post-traumatic stress disorder was also on their advisory board. So setting up this advisory board to allow you as a charity to put their names on your letterhead and perhaps have a meeting with them and your board of trustees a couple of times a year to start the dialogue is a good way to spread your influence, in this case between a member of the armed forces, a politician and an academic, but also you could include a corporate sponsor at a senior level, perhaps the chairman or managing director of a company, who would be appropriate to fit in with this group of advisors for your charity. So it's just something you could think about if you're engaging with senior people from larger companies or larger organisations. And a final example of a target audience is high net worth individuals, or putting it politely, rich people. Their characteristics and motivation, they're often the best supporters. They're very motivated, they're very rich, which is a good thing, but they're also very motivated and they're generous to the charity if it fits their aims and objectives. Now, the previous chairman of the business that I used to work for in Paris, when we sold the business, this gentleman retired and he gave a huge amount of his assets when we sold the business to set up a foundation to support charities in sub-Saharan Africa. We're talking hundreds of millions of euros here. So if the charity fits the aims and objectives of the high net worth individual, then, you know, the sky is the limit. And I'm thinking here also, we've all heard of the Bill Gates Foundation, which gives literally billions of dollars to worthy causes that support the interests of Bill Gates and his wife. They may be willing also to be on your advisory board, as I've discussed earlier, and they may also afford to become a trustee. Though in my experience, people in this category often are very busy because they're still managing their working life. They may not have time, but they could certainly be possibly available to be on your advisory board. And of course, to get to this position that they have in life, they're often very financially astute and can provide advice and guidance for the good financial operation of a charity and a charitable organisation. So if you know any people like this, it's definitely worth cultivating them. If you look at the sorts of techniques you can use to engage with them, it tends to be personal contact, and it should come from a senior level in your organisation, whether it's your chief executive or the chairman of your board of trustees. It's this sort of level of contact that works well. And I've worked with some national charities in the UK where it was in fact the chairman or the head of the board of trustees who made the contact with the high net worth individual. It might be worth starting off this conversation in a sort of business social context with perhaps you host them for a lunch or a dinner to share the ideas for your charity and sound them out to see if they'd be willing to support you. Often they value special personal access to the charity's activities, and I'm thinking now of a national children's charity in the UK that for a particular group of high net worth individuals hosted a series of meetings and visits to the children's shelters that they were running across London and other major cities in the UK. And these high net worth individuals made, if you like, an anonymous visit, unannounced, just to see the work of the charity late at night when it was all hands to the deck, and they were helping some very distressed and some very disturbed young people who'd been abused or otherwise ill-treated, who come to their places of safety and refuge to get respite and support and get them out of the terrible situations they'd found themselves in. People at this level may also be willing to host an event, either at their office premises or their other social situation, or in a hotel or appropriate restaurant, to engage and work with other high net worth individuals of their acquaintance. Often people in this category know other high net worth individuals, and once they've bought into and are supporting your charity, they may be amenable to introducing their friends also into your charity circle. I'm thinking now of a chairman of a business who owns a very famous London restaurant, who's very involved in the charity field, and he and I were both trustees of the same charity a few years ago. So this individual hosts lunches and dinners in his own restaurant that he owns in the West End of London, and invites in other wealthy individuals from various fields of entertainment and sport and business to personal hosted dinners at his restaurant, to try and persuade them too to join in and support the charities in which he's interested and with which he's engaged. So that's a general overview of the sorts and tools and techniques you can use to engage with high net worth individuals. I'll go on to the last section of this briefing then, which is how to set about sorting out and structuring fundraising campaigns. Here's a reminder and a replay of a diagram I showed you in a previous briefing, which is the sorts of media patterns you can use when you're setting out a campaign. And if you think, for example, of advertising, this is the different ways you could structure advertising. It's steady, there's fighting, there's alternative even, pulsing, staggered, and so on. So this is really the frequency and the depth with which you do your communication, whether it's by email campaigns, social media, TV advertising, press, radio, whatever media you're using. These are the different ways you can, if you like, engage and deliver it into the market in terms of frequency and the depth of the communications activity. There's no correct way to do this, but it's just an example of the sorts of techniques you can use. I'll look at this in a little bit more detail in the next slide, where we talk about how some of these different frequency patterns could be used for particular campaigns in the area of fundraising. So let's look at the campaign patterns and campaign design you could use for the different sorts of communication I've been talking about up until now. If you're talking about general donations, this is an ongoing process. So having a donate button on your website or everywhere that you communicate is an ongoing and constant reminder, and making it easy and frictionless for members in any target stakeholder category to provide you and donate money as simply as easily as possible. And as I say, having a donate button everywhere that people are communicated with is a good starting point. So ongoing, constant, repetitive, frequent, reminding the target audience about the good that you do and asking them to make a donation. The second stage is related to events. Whether you're hosting charity dinners or you're doing some community fundraising, you need to build up campaigns to support and promote each event. So you could have a national event like Red Nose Day, or the UK's largest coffee morning, or the Lord Mayor's big curry lunch. Whatever it happens to be, you build up as many campaigns throughout the year to support the particular events that you or your supporters are putting on to support your charity and its operation. So in this case, you have multiple campaigns using a mixture of online and offline communications tools, such as the ones we've talked about in the previous briefings. The third category is corporate entities. And again, this is an ongoing process for most charities. Here we're talking probably about one-to-one personalised communications. If you want to engage with corporates, it's probably not appropriate to try and expect them to come and find you on social media or to answer unsolicited emails. This is more likely to be one-to-one personalised communication, either by telephone or by written letter, between your chief executive or the chairman of your board of trustees and a senior person in the target corporate business. They're more likely to answer a personalised letter than they are to answer an unsolicited email. And then finally, the fourth category I want to talk about is fund holders. And as I say, this is an ongoing research-based project, and it's a one-to-one connectivity and a one-to-one activity using desk research and in-depth analysis of the aims and objectives of the different fund holders to see if they fit with your charity's operation. And I suggest that if you can and you have the resources, either set up a dedicated resource for a single person or a small team to regularly work through all the sources of funding and see if there's any and many that can support you and provide funding or benefits in kind to help your charity organisation. So that's just an example of 4 different sorts of campaigns you could design, and read this in conjunction with the previous discussion we've had on marketing communications. Well, that brings me to the end of my discussion on fundraising. I hope you found it useful and of interest, and perhaps it sparked some ideas that you might wish to pursue further. Let me now remind you of the next steps in this overall briefing programme. As you can see, we've just got one more briefing on tactics, which is the next one that I'm going to share with you, which is the Economic Recovery Guide, which, as I explained, is something, the content of which has been produced by the chairman and members of the outreach team in the Marketors Livery Company. And that's something I'll be covering in a little bit more depth in the next briefing. So there'll be a review and some more ideas about fundraising as part of that briefing. If you do have any thoughts, ideas or questions or feedback about today's briefing, then please by all means get in touch with me using this email address of peter.rees@gmail.com, and I'd be delighted to hear from you, and I'll answer any questions you send as quickly as I can. I'll just wrap up then with my concluding remarks, and today's quotation, as you can see here, comes from John Bunyan, who says, "You have not lived today until you have done something for someone who can never repay you." And that really summarises the work that you guys do in charity. You do an outstanding job, and I hope today's briefing has helped you to build upon this idea and continue to do stuff for people which actually in many cases they'll never be able to repay. So thank you for the great work you do, and I look forward to joining you again in the next briefing. I'd just like to finish by saying thank you for your time and attention today. I hope you found this briefing useful and it's given you some new ideas about fundraising. I look forward to joining you again in the next briefing, and until we meet then, I'd just like to say goodbye for now, good luck and good marketing.